What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Who Wants to Brawl YouTube channel. That is not a question, that is a statement. My name is Who, and I'm letting you know I want to brawl. Here, we're all about the Magic format Brawl, specifically in regards to Magic Arena, so we don't have to worry about budget, we only have to worry about wildcards.
This episode is a new deck tech. On these episodes, I go over a new Brawl commander and walk you through my ideas and strategies of how best to build this commander. Today we're going to be taking a look at Shaile, Dean of Radiance. It's a 2-mana 1/1 flyer with Vigilance. It taps to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield under our control this turn. It's also a double modal face card. On the back is Ambrose, Dean of Shadow. It is a 2 black 4/4, and it taps to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Then Ambrose deals 2 damage to that creature. And then when a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, we draw a card. So with the Shaile side, we're going to want to take advantage of creatures that have +1/+1 synergies and payoffs. And then with Ambrose, we're going to want to have creatures that already have +1/+1 counters on it, or give our creatures +1/+1 counters easily, so that when they die, we draw a card. If we build this deck the right way, it can be pretty explosive, and then reload our hand with Ambrose later in the game. Let's take a look at how I would want to build this deck. As always, leave a comment with any upgrades and different ways you would take the deck. And with that, let's begin. Our first strategy is going to be creatures with counters on them. These are creatures that either enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on them, or acquire +1/+1 counters easily, so that way they can already have counters on them when Ambrose hits the table to help us draw the cards back when these creatures die. Or for our other +1/+1 counter synergies to already take effect as soon as we get those. First up, we're going to have Crystalline Giant, which gets a lot of ability counters as the game progresses. It gets 1 a turn, but one of those counters it gets is a +1/+1 counter, so that's the counter we're hoping to get the most. Otherwise, this is just a great value creature. And speaking of great value creatures, we have Hagra Constrictor, which is a 3-mana 0/0 and enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters, but gives all of our creatures with a 1/1 counter on them Menace, making them much more difficult to block in combat. An Oathsworn Knight enters the battlefield with 4 1/1 counters, has to attack each turn, but prevents damage that would be dealt to him, and instead removes a 1/1 counter. And then Basri's Lieutenant enters the battlefield and gives any creature we control a 1/1 counter. And then when a creature we control with a 1/1 counter dies, we get a 2/2 Knight. This is an excellent +1/+1 counter payoff. And then Spiteful Squad is just a 4-mana 0/0 Death Touch that enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters, and when it dies, we can move those counters to any creature we control. And Victory's Envoy is a 5-mana 3/3 that at the beginning of our upkeep, we give our entire board, other than her, a +1/+1 counter. Star Pupil is a 1-mana 0/0 that enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it, and when it dies, we can put its counters on any creature we control. Luminarch Aspirant and Fearless Fledgling are each 2-mana 1/1s that can take over the game on their own if left unchecked. The Luminarch puts a 1/1 counter on a creature we control at the beginning of combat, and the Fearless Fledgling gets a 1/1 counter in flying every time we have a land enter the battlefield. And Stonecoil Serpent has a mana cost of X. It's a 0/0, it has reach, trample, and protection from multicolored. Nice because a lot of commanders are multicolored. And it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Our next strategy is going to be removal. As with every Brawl deck, we have to stop what our opponent's doing, not just do our own thing. So how are we going to stop our opponents this time? Well, first, we're going to use Swallow Whole, which is a 1-mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, we have to tap a creature, but it exiles a tapped creature, and we put a +1/+1 counter on our creature. It's always nice when our removal synergizes with our strategy. Heartless Act is just a 2-mana instant that destroys a creature or removes 3 counters from a creature. Glass Casket is an artifact that exiles a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less until it leaves the battlefield. Feed the Swarm is an excellent 2-mana removal spell that destroys a creature or enchantment, and we lose life equal to its mana value. Dire Tactics is one of the best removal spells in Brawl if you have both white and black. It's a 2-mana instant that exiles a creature, and we lose life equal to that creature's toughness if we don't control a human. While Shaile isn't a human, Ambrose is, so at least we always have access to one. And then Banishing Light exiles any permanent until Banishing Light leaves the battlefield. Next up we have Closing Statement, which destroys a creature or planeswalker for 5 mana and then puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. However, if we cast this during our end step, it costs 2 colorless less to cast. And then Elspeth's Nightmare, for those that watch the channel, is my favorite removal for black in Brawl at the moment. It's a 3 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, we destroy a creature with power 2 or less. And then on Chapter 2, we look at our opponent's hand and force them to discard a non-creature, non-land card. And then Chapter 3, we exile their graveyard. A lot of value for 3 mana. And then we have another Elspeth saga in Elspeth Conquers Death, which is a 5 mana enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, we exile a permanent with mana value 3 or greater. And then the second chapter is non-creature spells our opponents cast cost 2 colorless less to cast until our next turn. And then Chapter 3, we get to bring a creature or planeswalker back from a graveyard with an additional +1/+1 counter or a loyalty counter. It's always nice when our reanimation spell synergizes with our commander. And then Hagra Mauling is a 4 mana instant that costs 1 less if our opponent controls no basic lands. It's pretty rare, but we might run into that with a Sika. And it destroys a creature, but most importantly, it can also be played as a land when we need it to. And then Heliod's Intervention takes out artifacts and enchantments, probably among the most efficiently in all of Brawl. It's X white, and we destroy X artifacts or enchantments. We can also use it to gain twice X life, but if we're doing that, we're probably going to lose anyway. And then Shatter the Sky is a 4 mana sorcery that destroys all creatures, but each player who controls a creature with power 4 or greater draws a card. We're almost always going to have that in this deck with giving our creatures +1/+1 counters, so this usually replaces itself in our deck. It is worth noting that if Ambrose is on the battlefield, his ability does count toward this. So all the creatures we have with a +1/+1 counter on it, we will draw a card for each of them. Next up we have some other +1/+1 counter payoffs. These are cards that don't necessarily enter the battlefield with 1/1 counters, so we can't rely on them for having them, but nonetheless are payoffs or add +1/+1 counters to all of our creatures and are absolutely vital to making the deck work. First up we have the Ozolith, which is a 1 mana legendary artifact. When a permanent we control leaves the battlefield, we put all counters that were on that permanent onto the Ozolith. Then at the beginning of combat on our turn, we can move the counters from the Ozolith onto a creature we control. This saves all the +1/+1 counters we give our creatures, even if they end up dying. And then Basri Ket is an excellent planeswalker in our deck. It's a 3 mana, 3 loyalty planeswalker, but its +1 ability gives a +1/+1 counter to a creature we control, and it becomes indestructible. That is the ability we want to use almost all the time in our deck. Its -2 creates a 1/1 soldier for each creature we control that's attacking. And then its -6 says at the beginning of combat on our turn, we create a 1/1 soldier and then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. So we want to tick this up and use that ultimate as soon as possible. And then Felidar Retreat is a 4 mana enchantment which also synergizes great in our deck. It has landfall. We either create a 2/2 cat or put a 1/1 counter on each creature we control, and they gain vigilance until end of turn. Skyclave Shadowcat is a little bit of Ambrose redundancy in our deck. For 2 mana, we can sacrifice a creature and put a 1/1 counter on it, but the more important text on it is whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, we draw a card. It's always nice to have another version of our commander kicking around in the 59 of our deck. And then Tenured Inkcaster is a 5 mana 2/2 that when it enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. And then whenever a creature we control with a 1/1 counter on it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. It's nice that this can put the +1/+1 counter on any creature in case a creature we want to have a counter on it doesn't quite have one yet. And then Shadrix Silverquill is excellent in this deck as a 5 mana 2/5 flying double strike. But at the beginning of combat on our turn, we can choose 2, and they have to target a different player. So we do one of these for our opponent and one of them for us. We can either give a player a 2/1 flyer, have a player draw a card and lose 1 life, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature a player controls. Oftentimes, we're going to want to give them a 2/1 and put a 1/1 counter on each creature we control. It synergizes with our deck, and usually the 2/1 is not enough to bite us in the butt. Next up, we have utility pieces. These are pieces that don't necessarily fit with the theme of our deck, but nonetheless help it to run a little bit better. Brawl and Commander are really the only formats that we can do this, so let's take advantage while we can. First up, we have a pair of format staples in Arcane Signet and Solemn Simulacrum. The Signet is a 2-mana artifact that taps to add mana of any color in our commander's color identity, while the Simulacrum is a 4-mana 2/2 that enters the battlefield. We search our library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and then when it dies, we draw a card. Then Tome of Legends is a 2-mana artifact that helps with card draw. It enters the battlefield with a page counter and gets a page counter when our commander enters the battlefield or attacks. And for 1 mana and tapping it, removing a page counter, we draw a card. Callous Blood Mage is an often underutilized utility piece in Brawl. It's a 3-mana 2/1 that when it enters the battlefield, we can choose one, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token that has when it dies, we gain a life, we draw a card and lose a life, or we exile target player's graveyard. None of these options are great on their own, but the fact that it gives so many options makes this card perfectly playable in Brawl. At the very least, it's just a card that replaces itself. Mangara the Diplomat is a card that helps with card draw. We draw a card when our opponent casts their second spell a turn, or when they attack with 2 or more creatures. It's also a 2/4 lifelink, which helps to stall the game out a little bit. And then Silverquill Silencer is a card that I was really excited to play with Brawl, but I'm not sure how it's working. We're going to continue to try it. It's a white and a black for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, we choose a card name. Usually we choose our opponent's commander. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell with that name, they lose 3 life and we draw a card. This is usually either a target for removal or does its thing at least once. Either way, I'm perfectly fine with that. And then Kaya the Inexorable is a 5-mana planeswalker. It's +1, we put a ghost form counter on a creature we control, and then when it dies or is put into exile, we return it to our hand and create a 1/1 flyer. But most importantly, it's -3, exiles any non-land permanent. Its ultimate allows us to cast a legendary creature from our hand, graveyard, or among cards we own in exile without paying its mana cost. We almost never want to do that anyway because we don't have enough legendary creatures. It might be nice to play our commander, but I don't think that's necessarily worth the giving up the other abilities on it. And then we're also going to run Humiliate, which is a 2-mana sorcery for a white and a black that our opponent reveals their hand, we choose a non-land card from it, they discard it, and then we put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. It's nice to get rid of the biggest threat in our opponent's hand while also adding a counter to a creature on the board. And finally, we're going to round the deck out with some land. First up, we're going to run 4 cards that each enter the battlefield tapped, and tap to add a white or a black. Temple of Silence also scries 1 when it enters the battlefield. Scoured Barrens also gains a life when it enters the battlefield. Shine Shadow Snarl can enter the battlefield untapped if we reveal a swamp or a plains from our hand as it enters. And Snowfield Sinkhole is also a plains or a swamp. And it's also a snowland, but that doesn't actually come up in this deck. And then we're going to run a double Modal Phase card in Bright Climb Pathway and Grim Climb Pathway. One of the sides taps to add white, while the other taps to add black. And then we're going to have Command Tower as a staple, just taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Then we're going to have a couple of fetch lands that each enter the battlefield tapped in Evolving Wilds and Fabled Passage. However, in Fabled Passage, we can untap that land if we have 4 or more lands in play. And then we're going to round things out with 8 plains and 7 swamps. And now, as with all of my decks, I'm going to talk about some upgrades. These are some cards that I missed on the first time I built the deck, and I go in afterwards and take out cards that didn't quite work as well as I thought they would. Let's see what I missed on this time. The first place I missed was on Victory's Envoy. This is a card that reads a lot better in this deck than it actually plays. It's a little too overcosted and doesn't quite impact the board quick enough for us. It also doesn't put a counter on her, which is really bad. So we're going to swap her out for Bloodsky Berserker, which is a 2-mana 1/1, but when we cast our second spell each turn, we put 2 1/1 counters on it and it gains Menace. This gains counters on its own and also is much cheaper and much more efficient. Overall, an easy upgrade. And then we're going to swap out Spiteful Squad for Light of Hope. Spiteful Squad is similar to Victory's Envoy in this deck. It's a little overcosted for what it does and doesn't impact the board quite enough for its cost. So we're going to swap it out for Light of Hope, which destroys an enchantment or puts a 1/1 counter on a creature we control. The flexibility is enough to make it work. We can also gain 4 life in a pinch, but like with Heliod's intervention, if we're gaining life, we're probably a little too far gone. And then we're going to top our theme of bringing the casting cost of our deck down with taking out Tenured Inkcaster and putting in Oblivion's Hunger. Once again, Tenured Inkcaster just doesn't impact the board enough to justify its cost of 5 mana, so we're going to put in something that helps protect our creatures and rewards us with drawing a card if that creature has a +1/+1 counter on it. So that does it for Shaile and Ambrose. What did you think of this deck? Do you want to give it a shot? What changes would you make if you did try it? Let me know in the comments below. I'm interested to know what you think. To be honest, I don't think I quite hit the mark on this one right off the bat on my first shot. So in this deck, even more than others, I'm curious to know what upgrades everyone else would play. So let me know, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.